Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the opening plenary of the 2026 MSR Research Colloquium, The Mystical and Research, Dwelling at the Threshold of Knowing. My name is Tianyuan Yu. I'm MSR representative at large for research and leading the colloquium organizing committee. I'm joined by tech hosts Daniel Nichka, Aditya Agrawal, and Raja Kanuli, who will support the technical side of our time together. If anything arises technically, please contact any of them through the chat. Before we begin, I invite you to take a quiet moment to arrive. Look around this virtual room. The faces and names on the screen. Simply notice who is here with us. Let's send joy, gratitude, and compassion to everyone in this shared space. It's now my pleasure to invite our MSR Research Committee member, Dr. Gaitong Mormont, to lead us in a brief opening grounding practice. Gaitong, over to you.
Thank you, Tian. So we're just going to do a mix of mindfulness and Bhakti meditation. So let's take 3 deep breathing. You can close your eyes. And as you breathe out, you just let go. Let go of your slides, let go of your day. Very gently bring your consciousness, your awareness to your heart. Be aware of your beautiful heart. You can give yourself a little hug. And very gently send beautiful loving kindness to every person in this room. You can give them a virtual hug. And as you're receiving one, just open your heart for receiving this loving kindness that is shared among us. Gently bring your awareness to your crown. Gently send loving kindness to the entire earth, to every person, every being on earth. Moving up, gently connect to your soul, to the source. And from that place of bliss, connect to the soul of the people in this room. Connect to all the souls in the universe. Be still and just let go. Gently go beyond. Be still. Just let go. Be aware of divine bliss. Be aware of divine joy.
Just a sec.
Be aware of divine happiness. And very gently, very slowly, Bring your consciousness down to your body, down to this room. One more time, sharing this divine bliss, this divine joy, this divine happiness with everybody in this room, with the entire earth, with all the souls in the universe. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes with a beautiful mystical smile. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Gaitong, for helping us feel grounded. Now I would like to offer a brief overview of the colloquium. Over the next 36 hours, we will gather around the theme, the mystical and research, dwelling at the threshold of knowing. This colloquium includes 4 plenary sessions and 20 regular sessions, featuring presentations, experiential practices, and open conversations. Because this is a global online gathering, we have organized the program into 7 blocks of time. Each block includes 3 to 5 sessions, with longer pauses between blocks, so participants can join in ways that are meaningful and sustainable. Please feel free to move through the program with care for your own body and life circumstances. Our hope is not for you to attend every single session, but that you enter the gathering with curiosity, openness, and courage. This colloquium has been created through the work of many people. I want to thank our keynote speakers, presenters, flamekeepers, facilitators, tech hosts, MSR leadership team, and everyone who has supported this collective endeavor. I want to especially recognize the amazing organizing committee members. Naida Culshaw. Daniel, can you spotlight Naida, please? Thank you. Stacey Guenther. Constantine White. Gaitong Moment. Aditya Agrawal. Daniel Nichka. And myself. We are a dream team that makes dreams come true. Can we wave our hands together, please? Thank you so much. Now, I would also like to offer my deep thanks to our wonderful tech team. This global online colloquium would not be possible without the generous support of our tech volunteers. They are Raja Kanuli, Elham Malik, Shoma Datta, and Angela Chen, who is unable to make it for this session because of time zone difference. Thank you, my tech volunteer team. You are wonderful. I invite all participants to help co-create the spirit of the colloquium as a shared inquiry. As you move through the sessions, we invite you to notice key ideas, phrases, questions, images, or moments that stay with you. We hope to bring these insights into our closing plenary, where we reflect collectively on what has emerged and looking ahead. One reflective inquiry prompt you might carry throughout the colloquium is, what themes, insights, or questions are emerging for you, and how might they shape the research you feel called to pursue? During the third plenary, I will invite participants who have attended 3 or more sessions and are willing to share at the closing plenary to self-identify by contacting Gaiton through the Zoom chat. Please note that recording has been on since the beginning of the plenary and will continue until we move into open impromptu participant discussion during this plenary, so that everyone can engage more freely. This will be our general recording approach. Presentations, guided practices, and invited dialogue will be recorded, but open participant discussion will not be recorded. The only exception is the closing plenary, which is designed as a participant-centered collective reflection session and will be recorded in full. And all the recordings will be available through the MSR YouTube channel. Finally, it is my pleasure to introduce the hosts for this opening plenary. Naida, Culshaw, and Dr. Stacey Guenther, both members of the MSR Research Committee and the colloquium organizing team, will co-host this plenary session with Dr. Louis Jody Fry, our flamekeeper partner. Together, they will help hold this intellectual, relational, and spiritual space for the opening plenary. Next, Stacey will introduce the agenda of the plenary and our keynote speaker, Dr. Andrew Newberg. Stacey, over to you.
Thanks, Jen, and welcome everyone. We are really delighted to be kicking off this research colloquium. We hope that you find it as wonderful and dynamite as we do. We've been working hard to bring this to you, and we're very excited about all the presentations and just to be with you all in this way. So I wanted to give a brief overview of this plenary session. In a moment, Dr. Andrew Newberg is going to speak. He's going to speak for about 30 minutes, and following that, Jody Fry is going to engage him in some Q&A. We'll also accept and invite your questions from the audience, so be ready to jump in with your questions. We'd love to have those. Following that, we're going to go into a small group discussion because the theme of this whole colloquium is the mystical and research. The mystical is one of those terms we really need to talk about so we can all have a shared mental model of what we're talking about as we go into the colloquium. So we will have an opportunity for you to go into small groups to have that conversation and then to have a discussion as a larger group. So that is the road ahead. I hope that you're able to stay with us the whole time. I think we're going to have fun this morning. So what I'd like to do now is to introduce our really wonderful speaker and keynote, and that is Dr. Andrew Newberg. He's a physician, a neuroscientist, and one of the world's leading researchers at the intersection of brain science and spiritual experience. As research director at the Marcus Institute of Integrative Health at Thomas Jefferson University in the US, he has spent more than 3 decades pioneering a field he calls neurotheology, the scientific study of how the brain gives rise to religious and mystical states. Using brain imaging technologies, including SPECT and PET, Dr. Newberg has scanned the minds of Buddhist meditators, Franciscan nuns in prayer, and practitioners across a wide range of traditions, producing some of the most compelling empirical evidence we have for what actually happens in the brain during profound experiences of unity, transcendence, and the divine. He has authored 14 books, They've been translated into 17 languages, and including books Why God Won't Go Away, The Mystical Mind, particularly relevant for this colloquium, and Neurotheology. Dr. Newberg has never been content to simply reduce mystical experience to neural firing patterns. He insists that explaining the brain basis of these states tells us nothing final about their ultimate reality. A humility that has made his work as meaningful to theologians and contemplatives as it is to scientists. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Andrew Newberg.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. Very excited to be able to share with you some of the work that I've been doing over the last 3 decades. I hate using that particular term because I hope I'm not that old, but I guess I am. But anyway, it's great to be able to connect with all of you, and hopefully this is a good kind of kickoff to the topics and the discussions that you're going to have. You know, in a half hour, it's extremely difficult to really give the topic its due. There are so many wonderful questions, so many different directions to go, so many things to think about, and that's part of what I love about doing all of this research. There's just so many different challenges. And it really ranges from very practical questions about, how various practices like meditation can affect us and maybe be helpful on a kind of clinical level, psychological or physical or mental health, to very profound questions about the nature of reality and who we are as human beings. So hopefully I'll kind of touch on all of that and give you a little bit of a taste for where I have gone with some of this work. So I'm going to share my screen and bring up my slides. Okay, so hopefully this is a good keynote lecture to start your entire discussion off with what exactly is mysticism. You're going to be talking about it throughout the program. There are lots of different words and terms that I have come across, and this is just probably a partial listing. At least some of the more common ones, things like enlightenment, knowledge. What I find interesting about this overall list, without going into each one of them, is again, kind of a broad array of terms that relate to things like our cognitive function, our emotional processes, our experiential, the things we feel, senses of knowledge, senses of spirituality, consciousness. So when we talk about these kinds of spiritual or mystical experiences, there's so many different ways of talking about it. And I think in and of itself, you heard the term neurotheology in my introduction, and as a field of study, and we'll talk about it a little bit more, one of the important things about it is that we're constantly engaging our topics and we're constantly asking questions. So, it's not just enough to look at what Buddha had to say about mysticism, but what does the everyday person who may have had an experience that they felt might be spiritual or mystical, what do they have to say about it as well? And then ultimately trying to translate all of this into the combination of who we are as a biological, psychological, social, and spiritual being. And that, of course, comes out of my world of integrative medicine as well. Now, of course, to some degree, I'm going to try to frame the topic a little bit. Again, we could spend a week just talking about, a given tradition like Hinduism or Buddhism. But it is important for people to realize that there are so many people who've talked about mysticism really around the world and in virtually every tradition. So Hinduism talks about mystical consciousness as the essence from which the universe emerges, and enlightenment means that you've become one with this kind of fundamental reality. In Taoism, there's more of a discussion about the natural flow of the universe and becoming connected to that harmony and to the principles that guide nature. In the Buddhist tradition, enlightenment and mysticism is a bit more personal at times. It's kind of a process of continual self-reflection until you extend beyond the self and get beyond the suffering that attachments to the material world provide for us. In Zen Buddhism, enlightenment usually is brought about by a realization of the radical truth that everything is kind of an illusion of the mind, and that there is a fundamental reality that gets beyond that. And that's what the mystical experience helps to bring us to. So just many different ways of thinking about it. Of course, mysticism occurs not only in some of the Eastern traditions, but in Western traditions as well, some of the monotheistic traditions. Almost all of the monotheistic traditions, Judaism, Islam, Christianity, have a mystical component to it. For the most part, these are brought about by a kind of mystical union with God, certainly, or at least the God based on how that tradition understands God. So in Judaism, it's a mystical union with God. In Sufism, which derives out of the Islamic tradition, it's a bit more out of the Quranic teachings and how one surrenders to God. In Christianity, again, a bit of a mystical union with God, a bit of a cloud of unknowing, per se, in terms of what we can know and what we can kind of release ourselves to. Usually we don't see the term enlightenment used quite as often in these traditions, but I've always been struck by the idea that when people seem to have these kinds of mystical experiences and come in contact with God, they are frequently described as having light or energy kind of coming from them. So I think no matter what tradition one takes, there are many different approaches that lead us to a kind of mystical experience. The one thing I often, when we wrote a book on how enlightenment changes your brain, the other piece to all of this, which I think is worth mentioning here, especially in the context of research and exploring these kinds of experiences, is that not only do we have enlightenment as a kind in the kind of spiritual context of many of these religious and spiritual traditions, but the age of enlightenment back in the 1700s was the idea of trying to get away from all of the religion and mysticism and trying to derive our knowledge and enlightenment of the world on rational processes and scientific pursuits, trying to get us kind of outside of the kind of the existing state of ignorance, if you will, as Kant talked about, and really having a kind of freedom from religion and spirituality. So just interesting how enlightenment itself as a term has kind of, looked at things from a variety of different perspectives. This is why I love the concept of neurotheology, because it is a true merging of all of these different perspectives on enlightenment. It could be a scientific perspective, it could be a naturalistic perspective, it could be a spiritual, it could be religious. And so there are many different ways in which we can ultimately look at these kinds of topics. And that's part of what I want to present today. Now, I'm going to be talking in a few moments about some of the brain scans that we've done so that you can get a little bit of a sense of what this connection is in the context of the neurophysiology of who we are. But before I do that, I want to just finalize this discussion about the nature of mystical or spiritual experiences that when I do a brain scan of somebody, it's kind of meaningless unless I understand exactly what they're doing, what they're thinking, what they're feeling. And so this prompted us to do an online survey of people's most intense mystical or spiritual experiences. And we ran this survey. It was online for about 5 or 6 years altogether. We got about 2,000 people who ultimately responded to this. And it was really a treasure trove of data for us because we got information about where they were from, their religious and spiritual background. We gave them all different kinds of questionnaires about their spiritual beliefs and psychological status and so forth. And ultimately, we gave them a box and we said, describe your most intense spiritual experience to us. And so we got this narrative that we felt was extremely valuable for us to be able to see what do people say. Again, on one hand, we can look at some of the great spiritual leaders. We can look at the Dalai Lama and what he has to say. We can look at what's been written in sacred texts and so forth. But what does the everyday person feel when they have these kinds of experiences? And this data was incredibly valuable to us. And we've published a number of articles about what people wrote about and what these experiences were. And I'm going to share some of that with you. Now, on one hand, every person's experience was unique. There were no two experiences that were described exactly the same way. There are no, everybody had something that was truly unique to them. And I found that to be quite fascinating and very rewarding because I think it does sort of speak to the power and the profoundness of these experiences. However, on closer examination, what we also realize is that you could start to categorize things based on how people use different terms. And you saw in that first slide all these different terms that people use. Well, people use different terms for a lot of different things. And so, for example, when you talk about, for example, a feeling of intensity, there could be a lot of ways of describing what is intense. And so when we started to group all of these different terms together, we found that there were 5 core elements that virtually everyone talks about as part of their mystical experiences. And that's a feeling of intensity, a feeling of clarity, a feeling of unity, a sense of surrender, and a sense of kind of transformational effect that leads to a permanent change in who you are. So maybe I could have used the word transformation, but in number 5, but it's something that kind of changes the person and changes them. I'll say forever, but certainly for a long time, often for their lifetime. So let me dive into these a little bit more detail. Part of what was so wonderful about this, and this just came out of the descriptions. So part of what was so wonderful about this is that all of these different core components can be traced to different biological processes, particularly in the brain itself. So let's take a look at a couple of these. And actually, I'm going to go through all of them. So here is a discussion about intensity. So here is a specific, I pulled this out of one of the descriptions that we had. It was a 43-year-old male. And he said this. He said, I, as an unnameable but individual being, was traveling down an infinite roller coaster like waves of pure white ecstatic light. The ecstasy was overwhelming and rose and fell in intensity with the waves of light. The light path seemed infinitely long in both directions. The sense of the being and the light was infinitely more real than anything I had ever experienced. And I will tell you that the capitalization there was by the person, not by me. So again, you can see so many words in just this few sentences that have an intensity to them. Infinite roller coaster, pure, ecstatic light, overwhelming, infinitely long, infinitely more real than anything ever before. So again, this was an incredibly powerful experience, and this is what we tend to see in virtually every experience that people have. Now, again, it could be different. It could be a very intense thought. It could be an intense feeling of love. It could be intense kind of experiences like this one. But there's always some element of it that really makes it completely different than all of the everyday experiences that we have. Now, what's going on in the brain when somebody has an intense experience? So you heard in my introduction that one of the main modalities that I use is something called SPECT imaging. SPECT is an acronym. It stands for Single Photon Emission Computed Tomography. And what that is, it's a complex term for a kind of scan that we do where we inject a small amount of a radioactive tracer that follows some part of the brain's functions, brain's physiology. Excuse me. In this case, we are looking at blood flow. So we inject a tracer that kind of follows blood flow into the brain. And what we can do is inject a person while they're engaged in some practice, some meditation or prayer. And then when they're doing the practice, we do this injection. It kind of circulates in their brain for a few minutes, and it essentially gets locked into their brain. So we capture it's like taking a photo with an old camera on film that, you take the picture and then you develop it sometime later, but it tells you what happened when you click the camera and the shutter opens and you capture, the tree or whatever it is that you're looking at. So we can do that and capture a picture of the brain's function at a moment in time. And we frequently do that during a meditation or type of spiritual practice where they have intense experiences. Now, the way to just sort of orient you here, the colors represent the activity levels. So hopefully you can see my cursor, but the red areas are more active, followed by the yellow, the blue, and ultimately the black. They're different natural variations in the brain. So if you look at this particular person's brain, there's a fair amount of reddish and yellowish coloring throughout a lot of the outer parts of the brain. This is what's called the cortex. This is where the neurons are, which is why you get a lot of blood flow there. Some of the central areas you don't see as much blood flow, and that's appropriate. That's the way the brain works. The way to orient you in terms of anatomy, so we're basically looking at a slice through the brain. It's like if I took a large samurai sword and just sort of sliced the person right across from one side to the other, and you kind of pop the top of the head off, and now you're looking down on the brain. And so the top of the scan here is right behind the forehead. It's kind of if you were lying down, and I'm looking now down on the brain. So the top of the scan is the forehead, right? It's called the frontal lobe. The bottom of the scan is the back of the brain, and then of course you have the sides as well. So where this arrow is looking at is kind of at the side of the brain. It's part of the brain called the temporal lobe, and trying to have you look a little bit more at the inner part of the temporal lobe. This is a set of structures called the limbic system, and the limbic system structures probably things that you've heard of, structures such as the amygdala and the hippocampus. And what's interesting about these, now finally returning to our concept of intensity, is that these are very involved in emotional responses. And so when you feel a strong emotional response, these areas become activated. And that's exactly what we see in many of these different practices where a person has an intense emotional reaction to the practice, to the experience that they have. We see the limbic system turning on, and that's characterized in the scan. So what you're looking at here is their baseline scan. This is their brain more or less at rest. And what I'm going to do is now toggle to the scan when they're deep in their meditation or their prayer practice. You're going to see, if you focus where that arrow is, let's see what happens to that. So it's a kind of a little bit of little red, a little blushy red and yellows. And then all of a sudden, this area becomes very intense, much more intense than many other areas of the brain. So just to go back to that, a little bit of red and then to a very intense amount of red activity. So this makes a lot of sense. If the limbic areas of your brain become very active, you're going to perceive this as a very intense emotional reaction to whatever's going on with you. And in the context of a spiritual experience, it would make sense that this would be associated with a very powerful change in activity in the limbic system that seems to be associated with this feeling of intensity. And again, this could then be applied to a variety of different elements of the experience. And that in and of itself, let me just digress for a moment. We asked questions about the people's experiences in our survey in two ways. One was we gave them the box, as I mentioned. We just said, just tell us about what you felt. But we did ask some specific questions as well, because, as a doctor, I know that if you came in to see me and I say, how are you feeling? Most people say, I'm feeling pretty good. And then I say, okay, well, how's your head? Oh, well, yeah, I do have headaches from time to time. And, my ears have been ringing a little bit. How's your breathing? Well, yeah, sometimes I cough. And so suddenly I start asking specific questions, I get a much more detailed and nuanced response. So if you just ask people about their experience, maybe they had such an incredible, overwhelming feeling of love that's what they focus on, but they forget to tell you about other parts that are still very, very relevant and very important. So again, part of how we bring all of this information together is, not just do you feel an intensity, but what felt intense, for example, and we try to get a little bit more information about that. Now, the second core element, and these are not in any particular order, this is just the order that I have them in, is a sense of clarity. So what does that mean? So here is a description of a sense of clarity in a 37-year-old female scientist. When she had her experience, she said, everything in life seemed to click. I had this clarity, and it was just as if I was looking at life from the inside out. Despite my trepidation, this experience seemed to satisfy my proof-oriented mentality with the concept of intuition. It was almost as if my intuition from somewhere deeper had offered some sort of direct experience that offered up proof. So what we're seeing here is this sense that now the person truly understands the world in a different way. There's a sense of clarity. The veil is thrown off, and they're seeing the world in a way that's like, aha, I've got it. I understand things now, and I didn't understand things before. Now, where in the brain might that go? What areas of the brain might that be associated with? So if we look at the brain, we see that deep inside of the brain are a couple of structures, and this is called the thalamus, or thalami for plural. You can see a couple of things about this. This is in the very center of the brain, and that's important because it actually helps to connect different parts of the brain to each other. And so it has a deep relevance in terms of how our brain just sort of puts together our whole perspective of reality. In addition, what we also have found out is that the thalamus is very involved in bringing sensory information up into the brain, particularly from the ears and eyes. So it makes sense then that a central structure might be very affected by these kinds of experiences that changes the whole way that we see the world and maybe gives us that sense of clarity. So here is a scan of the brain that we have again at rest, and we see that there is a kind of equal amount of activity in both sides of the thalamus. But let's look at what happens when the person is deep in their spiritual practice, having this intense spiritual experience. We can see that the thalamus goes from a relatively equal amount of activity on both sides to a shift that one side now seems to become much more active. So again, I'll go back to here, and then we go to the shift of activity. So now, again, this is something that we haven't fully established yet in terms of how this relates to the feeling of clarity. But this is my best hypothesis because we see this a lot. We see changes and shifts in the thalamus. In fact, in people who have had intense experiences, even at rest, we see some shifts in how their thalamus is working compared to people who have not had that kind of an experience. So we think that this is a very important area of the brain that is probably related to some of that aspect of the experience where they feel that sense of clarity as part of the spiritual or mystical experience that they're having. Now, here is the third element of these experiences. In many ways, I probably should lead with this because I think this is perhaps one of the most common elements of these experiences, and certainly one of the more powerful ones, more commonly described, which is a sense of oneness, a sense of unity, a sense of connectedness. The different words, as you can see, there's different terms that all get kind of folded into this sense of unity. The same is true for intensity. As you saw in the discussion, it was overwhelming, it was an infinite, and so forth. So there are different words that become part of this larger category that we're talking about. So here was a feeling of unity that was described by a 45-year-old female scientist who happened to have a Hindu background. And she said, during my meditation, tears were streaming down my cheeks when I experienced the feeling of oneness with all beings. Again, she capitalized that, not me. My body felt very light. Rather, there was no separation between me and other external reality. There was no sense of self. We see this just over and over and over again, people talking about a sense of oneness, a sense of feeling connected to the universe, to God, whatever it is that is their experience, a loss of the sense of self, for example. So these are an extremely common element of these experiences. And we think that this actually also has a very interesting connection to something going on in the brain. So now if we're looking towards the lower part of this scan, which is actually the back part of your head, this is a structure called the parietal lobe. And the parietal lobe normally takes sensory information and helps us to kind of put a spatial perspective of ourself together. So when at the end of the day here, when you get up out of your chair and walk out of your room, your parietal lobe is kind of helping you to figure out how to get up out of the chair, how to navigate through the doorway, and so forth. Now, on this scan, again, at rest, you can see that the brain has a relatively equal amount of activity all the way around both sides of the frontal lobes up here and the parietal lobes in the back of the brain. But during intense meditation, what we see is a shift of activity in this parietal lobe. And now you're going to see that where the arrow is pointing, it goes from a deep sense of red to a lot of yellows and just a little bit of red. So here again, a lot of red to mostly yellow. And we can also see this occur on the other side as well. In this particular case, it was a little bit more prominent on this particular side. So what does this mean? Well, again, if the parietal lobe kind of turns on to help us create a spatial sense of ourself, then when it shuts down, we would lose that spatial sense of ourself. We would have a blurring between ourselves and the boundaries between other objects. We may see a blurring of the boundaries between objects and space. And so we think this is actually a very important change that occurs in the brain when somebody has a feeling of oneness or connectedness. And again, we see this quite universally in the practices that we have studied. We've studied over several hundred individuals doing all different kinds of spiritual practices. Now, the fourth element is a feeling of surrender. So here is a description of surrender in a 48-year-old Catholic woman. She said, I surrendered everything, including my faith and my salvation, and only for one reason. I loved God so much that I would truly give up everything to be connected with him. I said yes, and in an instant, God returned everything to me transformed. From that day forward, a new relationship exists between God and me. It is ever present, no distance, no separation. I am not attached to doctrine, dogmas, or rituals. I see God all around me. So here we see actually, again, almost all of the elements that I've already talked about. Very intense feelings. I love God so much. So, a very intense experience, powerful emotions. a sense of oneness. There's no separation between God and this individual. But in this case, we're talking about a sense of surrender, which is leading to this. And what we mean by surrender here is that at some point, and for those of you who have had these kinds of experiences, I think you would recognize, not only all of the elements that we're talking about, but this one as well, that at some point it feels like you're not the one making it happen. It's something that's happening to you. You are along for the ride. And to the extent that you actually can surrender to that, let go, give oneself, again, stop, however you decide to describe it. There's a sense of surrender where the person no longer feels that they're the one in charge of this whole process. It is something that happens to them, and they let themselves go into it. So the area of the brain that we think is involved in this may be in the front of the brain, the frontal lobe. So now we're looking at the top of this scan. That's where the frontal lobe is. And the frontal lobe normally turns on when we are purposely doing things, when we're concentrating on things, when we're trying to make things happen. So when we look at the frontal lobe, at rest, when we look at what happens during the midst of this very intense kind of experience and this feeling of surrender, what happens? Well, here we see mostly kind of yellows and oranges here, some reds. But what happens during the intense practice is that we see that this part of the brain turns down into almost the greens here. So it goes from reds and yellows down to kind of a greenish activity. And what we're seeing here is that the frontal lobe is actually quieting down. So again, if the frontal lobe turns on to help us feel purposeful and like we're the ones making it happen, when it shuts down, we kind of are giving ourselves over to this particular process and giving ourselves over to the experience itself. And that seems to be associated with these decreases of activity in the frontal lobe. Now, the final element of these experiences is that transformational change. And when we ask people about the transformations that arose as a part of these experiences, what we are very intrigued by is that they are overwhelmingly positive. People, not just from a spiritual perspective, although certainly that's the case, but people no longer fear death. They have a better perspective on their own sense of health and well-being, a sense of meaning and purpose in life. So these experiences really change people almost overwhelmingly for the positive. Now, again, hopefully you did notice that sometimes things don't go so well. It's a pretty small percentage, maybe 2 or 3% on average. But this in and of itself is an important area for future work because we do want to understand what happens when these experiences don't go well. What's going on? Are they literally bad experiences that people have? Is it that the person had a positive experience, but they just, are so afraid of what to do with it? But ultimately, that is part of this whole discussion. But for the most part, we see very positive, very transformational changes that are going on in the brain. And so we can ask this kind of question, which is, how did all of this happen in the first place? How did we get all of these changes going on in the brain? How is it related to the spiritual experiences that people have? And, there are two broad answers to this question. One is the religious or spiritual answer, which is, well, if there is a spiritual world, if there's God, then sure, it makes sense that we would be created with a biological the biological machinery to be able to make that connection, to be able to have these kinds of experiences. So that's certainly one way of looking at this answer. Another answer is to take a more materialistic biological answer that maybe there is a natural connection between spirituality and our biology. Maybe it has something to do with how we have evolved the biological part of ourselves. Maybe there's a connection between what our brain tries to do for us in terms of helping us to navigate through the world, to ask questions about the world, to transcend ourselves. That may, ultimately be something that is very important for us in one way or another. And one of the more recent books that I wrote was called Sex, God, and the Brain. And I actually took a look at what may be an evolutionary answer to these questions. There's a lot of relationship between, for example, sexual experiences in terms of some of those core elements, intensity, feelings, a sense of oneness, a feeling of surrender that might be associated with that. And that might make sense that there is a kind of overall connection between sexuality and spirituality. It's something that we are continuing to look at and trying to explore, whether there are different, similar or different biological processes. It's very some of the early work that my late colleague, Dr. Eugene DeQuilly, and I did looked at the relationship between the rituals that are part of spiritual traditions and practices that lead to mystical experiences, if these rituals evolved within the human brain, they evolved from animal rituals, and animal rituals are essentially mating rituals. And so the overall connection here seems quite intriguing, and it is something that we are continuing to explore as we get into our field of neurotheology. So before I conclude, I just want to give you a couple of ideas about what neurotheology is as a field. Specifically, it is a field of scholarship that seeks to understand the relationship between the brain and theology. But I think in order for this term to work, and there are certainly other possible terms that we could use, but neurotheology seems to be the one that seems to have stuck. I think we need to define both sides very broadly. So the neuro is not just neuroimaging, but it's neuroscience. It can really be almost all of medicine. It could be looking at our immune system and so forth, our autonomic nervous system, our consciousness, all the ways we get at kind of our mind and our brain. And while we can look at theological questions that may derive from a given tradition, the idea that we can look not just at theology itself and big theological questions, but spiritual practices, spiritual experiences, religious or spiritual beliefs. If we kind of put all of that into the side of theology, then I think neurotheology really has an opportunity to go somewhere and to explore some very big questions. Ultimately, as you heard in my introduction, I really feel that neurotheology is a two-way street. It's not just science looking at religion and spirituality. It's not religion and spirituality looking at science, but it's the two of them coming together to help us understand who we are, to help us understand some of the most profound and powerful experiences that we can have as human beings. And that to me is really where I feel all of this comes together. So ultimately, hopefully what you've seen is that mystical experiences have a tremendous impact on our brain, on ourselves as individuals. I certainly probably don't have to tell most of you that if you've had these kinds of experiences, but they transform a person's whole view of reality, their sense of relationships, job, God, how they look at science, religion, everything. But one of the most important takeaway messages, I think, of all of the work that I've done over the years, and also came out of the 2,000 some odd responses that we got from the survey, is that these aren't experiences that can only happen to the monk that's sitting on a mountaintop. These are experiences that seem to be able to happen to anyone and to everyone. And that to me is an extremely positive and optimistic viewpoint, which is that hopefully we can find ways of helping people to have these experiences. And that, if you do a brain scan of everyone's brain on the planet, for the most part, with a few exceptions, they're all basically the same. They all have their frontal lobes and their limbic system and their parietal lobes, and they all kind of operate the same way. So theoretically speaking, these are experiences that might be available to all of us. And I certainly encourage all of you to think about this. So if you are interested in exploring some of these topics in more detail, as was mentioned in the introduction, I have a number of books there that are available. And you can also go to my website to look a little bit more at some of the research that we've done and the methodological approaches that we take, and also follow me on my own personal journey on Instagram. So I will leave it there. And if you have some questions, I think we have a little bit of time to go over that. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Dr. Newberg. That was fascinating on so many levels. So thank you so much for that presentation. I'm going to invite Jody Fry in. Jody, and Daniel, if you would spotlight Jody. Jody, if you would be so lovely as to engage in some Q&A. That'd be great.
Okay, thank you, Stacey, and thank you so much, Andrew.
Thank you.
These types of conversations in terms of sharing, spiritual experiences and, transform what you call them, self-transcendence experience. I did read the article you sent from your titled "The Varieties of Self-Transcendent Experiences" in detail, and found it, obviously very, very informative. And thank you for sending that to me. And so many times at the Academy of Management and online and everything, we find ourselves sitting around sharing these kinds of experiences. And
sure,
I've had two near-death experiences, one in a car wreck and one in a flash flood. So I can definitely relate to your presentation today. I don't know how much it's informed my research other than just gratitude, which you also talk about, in your.
Yeah.
But I have a couple of questions. Of course, the first is, and the main, and I know you're not in a business school, and so I'm not trying to put you on the, I always hate when a reviewer challenges the paper I didn't write, when I submit it. So I don't want to put you in, in that situation. But our key emphasis here, of course, is on the research, the roles that spirituality and religion play in organizations and management, and leadership. So I have a couple, 3 questions. I want to make sure that we have time for the people that are here to ask you questions also. And the question to any area, when it's brought into another area, is so what?
Right.
Which also is so what about sitting around sharing these experiences? What are the implications of sharing the experience and finding oneness? And maybe what's more important here, and you do address this, since organizations and individuals within that context are purpose-driven, should be, is how do we translate these experiences into action? Have you looked at that much?
Well, yeah, no, absolutely. And in fact, I mean, it is interesting. I know the topic that I was asked to talk about was a little bit more on, mysticism itself. But a lot of my work actually has had, far more practical applications as well. And we talk about it as sort of an applied neurotheology. And my colleague, actually, Mark Waldman, who have co-authored a number of our last books together, has taught at the Loyola University in the School of Business, and speaks a lot about the nature of these kinds of experiences and the elements that come out of them. And you mentioned some of the other things, which is that, if these experiences bring about a sense of gratitude, a sense of meaning and purpose, a sense of connectedness, not just with, the big things like the universe or God, but with each other. And so, finding ways of kind of team building and utilizing if we could bring together a group of individuals who have an intense feeling together, who have a sense of clarity about what their goals are and how they're going to work together, a sense of connectedness and so forth. This really can be a great way of trying to help people to build teams that work together effectively. Part of what we also look at is how we communicate with each other. We wrote a book called Words Can Change Your Brain that derives a lot out of some of the practices that are part of this. Meditation practices, using ways of bringing mindfulness and deep listening into the boardroom, into the discussion about how people are going to work together, how we listen to each other, how do we resolve problems together, how do we, forgive each other for different issues and things that go on. So I think there really is a lot of practicality that can come about. Now I don't know if, sort of a full-blown mystical experience can ultimately, because we don't know who's going to have those and how, people are going to, utilize each a given one. But I think, again, in sort of the broader context, so many of the elements that are part of it, and maybe one thing I didn't emphasize is that there is a continuum of these experiences. And so, people who can, as you did at the beginning of the entire program today, a brief meditation before you start to have a dialogue about where you're going or what you're going to do. Those can be very important. And maybe the last thing to be said is that there's some very interesting information these days about how meditation practices affect a group of structures in the brain called the default mode network, which are part of how people are creative. And so, in thinking and fostering creativity within the workplace environment, I think those things could all be very, very relevant to this larger discussion.
No, I think that's brilliant, and I very much relate. I tend to, a number of definitions of workplace spirituality have emerged, but the one that I've used is a sense of finding a power greater than ourselves to move towards self-transcendence and a sense of interconnection with all it is. I mean, if that doesn't fit here, nothing does. And so I guess my last question is, and so that goes way beyond mystical experiences. It goes to that whole range that you mentioned in your article. So my last question here is, I mean, ideally, maybe one you could come up with the magic chamber and you put people in and you plug it in and it stimulates the brain, and all of a sudden we come out, more self-transcendent. But how do we facilitate these experiences? You already touched on that a little bit, so if you could expand a little bit more.
Yeah, so in a couple of our books, and how enlightenment changes your brain, how God changes your brain, we talk about some of the practices that people can do. It's a really important question because there are different issues, and I think I heard that you're going to have some discussions about ethics down the road. On one hand, people are on their own paths, and they do need to kind of find their own journey. So we can kind of give broad perspectives on how to think about things, but we also have to think a little bit about what are the approaches that a given person may need to take. And so, part of what we talk about are certain steps that people need to think about. And the starting point is where are you and what your goals are. For someone who comes from a deep Christian faith, they probably shouldn't be doing Hindu practices, or at least it may not be all that relevant to them because they have a strong Christian faith, or again, pick whatever tradition you want to come from. But that being said, maybe there are so many wonderful practices within each tradition that people can look to and engage and pursue. And so doing, again, if it was somebody who had a strong Christian faith, maybe it would be, well, let's think about prayer, let's think about self-reflection and meditation within that context. If somebody has a more secular approach, then we can have people explore different ideas. But part of it is what are the goals? Is the goal to really get to a spiritual transformation? Is the goal to get to a sense of belonging, a sense of understanding? And that's important because then what I often always tell people is to kind of do a little bit of the homework, which is to look at different approaches, different traditions, different practices. What are their goals, and do they align with where you're going? So we in our hospital we have a big mindfulness group, and so if people want to do stress management, that's a great program for that. But it's probably not the right program if you want to, strive for enlightenment, unless you have a different, context within which that can be done. And I think ultimately, though, people have to try certain approaches that they think are most relevant, that they think kind of match their goals, match who they are as a person, so that it feels comfortable to them. And then unfortunately, there's always a little bit of the trial and error because we never know exactly which approach may work. Our survey certainly shows that people sometimes tried many different things before they found the right combination to the lock, so to speak. And then other people, some of my favorite descriptions were, the guy was just walking down the street and suddenly, boom, he just saw the world differently. Or, as you mentioned in your personal example, I mean, not that I recommend people trying to get to near-death experiences, but they do happen, and we've written about that. Those are obviously, as you know, I mean, are can be wonderful experiences, very powerful and transformative experiences, and certainly, share a great deal with other types of mystical experiences. So there are many different paths to the top of that mountain, and people have to kind of explore what works best for them.
Oh, thank you so much. You're a blessing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Stacey, I'm not sure now. We may have run over relative to questions and the group, so I'm going to let you make a command decision.
Okay, Jody, thank you so much.
Dr. I can try to take one or two more if you want.
One or two, that's perfect. Thank you so much.
I'll answer them quick.
Thank you. Manish, go ahead.
Given that we are using the term neurotheology, I was wondering as to what is the cause and what is the effect. And therefore, would it be possible to think of some electrical impulses to the brain, which could probably provoke mystical experiences? And therefore, what is the lead and what is the lag in this? And therefore, has there been any evidence on that from the studies that get done?
Well, as I said, extremely important question. It's certainly something where I don't think there's an answer yet. I feel that for neurotheology to really work, it needs to be very careful with the conclusions that it draws. I frequently talk about associations or correlations. hopefully we can design studies that might be able to address more specifically the causal arrow. And I certainly hope that's the case. But, even like in the psychedelic research, for example, where you give a drug and somebody has an experience and, there feels like there's that causal relationship, and I get it. But one of the things that is very interesting is that, just because that all happens, the question is, is it allowing the brain, is it causing the brain to have that experience? Is it allowing the brain to be receptive to that experience? I always use the example of, I wear glasses, so I wake up in the morning, it's a very blurry world. I put my glasses on, I see clearly. So, is that what's going on? And I think that to me, though, lies at the heart of neurotheology, which is to be open to the different interpretations and to be able to try to explore more fully where these causal interactions are. I think we might be able to get to some answers, but we do have to be very careful about how that's done. And I certainly, at the moment, don't feel that we can go, one way or another, at least in any kind of really definitive way at the moment.
Thanks for that.
Thank you.
And thanks for your question, Manish. Jerry, please come on and share your question.
Yeah, I have what you were saying reminded me of sensitivity training and T group training back in the 70s. When people would go to T group training and they would have this experience, then they would come back to their work group and they were the only ones with it. So they're open and honest and have this experience, and then nobody else is there. And so I'm wondering if that's related to some of the negative experience that you had. It's like coming back to your family and trying to explain, or, to take a religious point, Jesus trying to explain the, Sermon on the Mount to somebody who doesn't know what he's talking about. So
Yeah, no, that's exactly one of the elements. That sometimes people have a wonderful experience, a near-death experience, as Jody was talking about, and then they go back to their clergy, to their family, and they get weird looks, and oh yeah, well, it was just the drugs, and and it can be very upsetting, especially if they get sort of shunned by the community that they thought they were connected to. So. Sometimes positive experiences can turn negative, but sometimes people seem to actually have negative experiences as well. And so, and there is this sort of broader negative side of religion and spirituality. I mean, people, as atheists always love to point out, how many people have been killed in the name of God and all that. So, what is going on in the brain of somebody who takes their spirituality in a positive, helping everyone, connecting with everyone, trying to make the world a better place versus someone who takes it in a negative direction. But yeah, I mean, that's definitely an issue and something that we need to continue to look at.
thanks. Yeah.
Thanks for your question, Jerry, and thanks for that answer. Dr. Newberg, just checking in with you. How are you doing? Do you need to leave us, or
I'm okay. I know you have more stuff to your program, but if you want, I can try to do.
More. These are just
Okay.
it's so meaty. I hate to cut it off. Tom, please
Yeah,
ask.
I just want to say appreciation to you, Andrew, for the work you're doing. It's amazing. I'm going to bring my question into secular institutions, and with the goal that recognizing there's a continuum of experiences between some sort of openness and total enlightenment. I think the area that I would really like to explore is the development of pedagogy that can be applied to anybody. And I'm thinking about, we think it's important that everybody learn math, basic math. We don't expect everybody to know how to do differential equations. I'm an engineer. But I think what we should be doing as a community is starting with what are the things that we can do to introduce to everybody that will move them along the continuum. And if we look 50 years or 100 years down the road, maybe we will be turning out, I don't know what you call it, but the equivalent of mathematicians who can do differential equations, but I mean from an inner work perspective, from a understanding who you are. So my question is, have you thought about pedagogy? Is that something that we could talk about? We have a group called Teaching and Learning, and I think this is a really rich and important area that we could work with you on, or that sort of thing. So that's my question.
Well, I'd certainly be more than happy to talk about it offline. I know a lot of people in the mindfulness world have tried to do that kind of thing, bringing mindfulness into schools and, elementary schools and things like that. I think all of that is a great concept and a great idea. And And I think there are ways of doing it without, when one applies it in a kind of secular context, the nice thing about that is that it can be accessible to everyone. And, so even if somebody's, very profoundly Catholic or whatever, we're not saying don't be Catholic, but we're just saying, how can you engage that part of you in a way that is more mindful, that you're paying more attention to, that you're using the positive elements to gratitude, forgiveness, and so charity and so forth, compassion. So yeah, I'd be all for it. And I've certainly thought about it over the years. I have colleagues who engage a little bit more on the practical side of things. So happy to feel free to reach out to me.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Love
Appreciate
it.
that.
Okay, we're going to take one final question, Dr. Newberg. You're being so very
Yep.
generous, and we're really grateful for it. Radha, do you want to ask your question?
Thank you. It is not a question, it's an observation. There was a discussion about causal relationship between activation of the centers. And I feel in our Vedantic philosophy, we have chakras in the body. And each chakra is the center of flow of an energy. So these chakras can be activated. There's chakra for sexual energy as well. And then causal relationship needs to be studied, as Dr. Newberg was talking about. There are studies, scientific studies, which need to be, conducted in this regard. That's a great session. Thank you very much, Dr. Newberg, for sharing your insights.
Thank you. Yeah, actually, I've been very eager and again happy to talk offline. But I've thought about the when we do a different kind of scan called a PET scan, where you can look at metabolic activity throughout the entire body. I've always thought it would be fascinating to be able to try to see if we can look at a biological signature of the chakras, and try to have somebody focusing on one or two particular ones and seeing if that actually shows itself something physiologically. And again, it might lead to an understanding on the causal relationships, as well as just a broader understanding of the connection between the spiritual part of ourselves and the biological part of ourselves. So thank you for bringing that up.
Thanks, Radha. And Dr. Newberg, I just want to thank you once again for being here today, for your brilliant presentation, for your lovely work that we all resonate with so deeply, and just your generosity. So thank you very much for being here. So grateful, and you have kicked us off the right way.
Well, thank you very much, and goodbye to everyone. And thanks again, and look forward to, feel free to reach out to me anytime.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right, my friends, we are now going to move into Naida. I'd like to call you into our little spotlighted area. We're going to move into a bit of a small group discussion, and Naida is going to cue that up for us.
Wonderful. So I believe I am actually, you can hear me, so this is good. So hello, everyone. So I'm Naida Culshaw, and I'm very excited to get us started and moving us into small groups so that we can exchange a little bit in an intimate setting, a little bit about the presentations, the presentation that was already given. And so I want to just invite us to stay with the central theme of the plenary, research and the mystical, dwelling in the threshold of knowing. And one way that Dr. Newberg and his colleagues in many of his papers help us talk about the mystical as an experience in which the ordinary sense of being separate or bounded self becomes less dominant, while the sense of connection and unity, which was one of the 5 things that he reviewed and presented, as well as oneness, becomes very vivid. So there's a language that is offered in this particular presentation for experiences that are not only on one end of that spectrum. So this was something that that Jody brought up also in the conversation, this idea that it's a continuum, something where you might move from awe, a sense of awe or flow, contemplative stillness, deep connection, surrender, or a felt sense of oneness. So anywhere along that continuum, this sense could be there. So in a short moment, we're going to be putting you into small groups, as I've mentioned. And during, you're going to have 15 minutes for a short discussion. There's going to be 3 questions that I'm going to walk through right now. They will also be placed in the chat as I go. So what I would invite you to do is go ahead and copy paste the questions, because once you go into the breakout groups, although we will send an announcement, you may not see them. So you may want to have them on some sort of copied space for yourself to reference. So pick one or two of the questions that are resonating for you. It isn't a group discussion of just one, so you can just jump in like popcorn and go ahead and jump in with your idea. One thing to note is after I finish all of the questions for you, we're going to stop the recording and put you into the breakouts. When you come out of the breakouts, just so that you know, the recording will be off, because we will do a large plenary. What came up for you? What emerged in your conversations? And I would love to have a few people just share either an individual aha moment or connection moment, or something, instead of sharing the entire thing everyone talked about, something that sort of stuck out for you in your group's discussion. So I'm going to start with the questions, and here we go. Question one is, what do we mean when we talk about the mystical? So when you hear the mystical, are you thinking more about the dissolution of self, so that sense of oneness, or that connection to something larger, or both sort of at the same time? Or when you hear the mystical, so just that phrasing, what kind of experience, reality, or way of knowing are you imagining? So what comes to your mind with those things? Then that's question number one. And I think when I was thinking about the presentation and taking some notes, the experience itself, or the interpretation of this experience, is, of course, as he said, was not the same. And our traditions, our language, our communities, our spiritual or secular commitments also shape how we may name what is happening. So, question two. How does the researcher's being play into researching the mystical? So if mystical experiences involve attention, affect, embodiment, interpretation, meaning making, then the researcher is never really detached as an observer. So the researcher's own being, your assumptions, your nervous system, spiritual history, openness, or resistance, may shape what can be perceived, asked, received, or interpreted. So this is sort of a framing for that question about your being. So we're thinking of all of these elements. Question three, related to a researcher's being, how do you hold spirituality in your positionality as a researcher? So I might also ask, what would it mean to research mystical experiences without either reducing it or romanticizing it? So how do you be, but then also stay rigorous in the work that you're doing? Now, as you enter the breakout, you may hold all three layers at once. You may choose one of the questions, as I mentioned, the experience itself, the language that is being used, or the tradition to interpret it, and the being of the researcher. So in the act of doing the research, your encounters, your studies, or how you facilitate the process. So we will have 15 minutes for discussion, and then we'll return for a full group exchange. And I'm looking for a few popcorns, so please be ready to jump up and share your thoughts. And Danielle, if you can go ahead and put people in, that would be great.
And
you'll have 12 minutes.
Yeah, just a little adjustment on time, but thank you.
Yes, I saw that, 12 minutes. So go ahead and please put everyone into the breakout groups and have fun. Enjoy the conversation.